Hello and welcome to lecture number 3 in the course Computer Graphics. Before we go into the topics of today's discussion, let me briefly recap what we have learned in the previous lectures. So, in the first lecture we got some basic introduction to the field, what is graphics and what are the main characteristics of this field. This was followed by a brief discussion on the historical evolution as well as the issues and challenges that confronts the researchers and the workers in this area. So, these three topics we have covered in the previous lectures. Today we shall introduce a basic graphics system, so that in subsequent discussions it will be easier for us to understand the content. So, what we do in computer graphics? The answer is simple. We generate or synthesize a 2D image from some scene and we display it on a screen. So, essentially generation of the images and display on the screen. Now, how do we do that? So, in the previous lectures we went into some details of these questions. Now, let us try to understand the answer from the perspective of the graphic system. So, if we look at a graphic system, the components that are likely to be there look something like this. So, we have a host computer where all the processing takes place. Then we have a display controller, one component of the graphic system, and this display controller takes input from the host computer in the form of display commands, and also it takes input from input devices. Various input devices we mentioned earlier for enabling us to interact with the screen content. Now, the output of the display controller goes to another component called video memory. Video memory content goes to a third component called video controller, which eventually displays or which eventually helps to display the image on the display screen. So, there are broadly three components that are unique to a graphic system: display controller, video memory and video controller. So, we will have a discussion, brief discussion on each of these components for better understanding. Let us start with display controller. Now, image generation task is performed by the display controller. So, when you say that in computer graphics our primary objective is to generate an image, that generation task is performed by the display controller, and it takes input from the CPU of the host computer as well as external input devices such as mouse, keyboard, joystick, etc. And based on these inputs it generates images. Now, these images are generated following a multi-stage process which involves lots of computation. One concern here is that if all these computations are to be carried out by the host CPU, then it may get very less time to perform other computations. So, a computer is not meant only to display, it is supposed to perform some other activities as well. Now, if the CPU is engaged with only the computations relevant for display, then it will not have time to perform other computations, which in effect will affect the throughput of the system. So, in such a situation, the system or the host computer system would not be able to do much except graphics, which definitely is not a desirable situation. To avoid such situations and increase efficiency of the system, The job of rendering or displaying is usually carried out by a dedicated component of the system, which probably some of us or all of us have heard of. It is called graphics card. Now, in this card there is a dedicated processor. Like CPU, we have a dedicated processing unit for graphics computing, which is called GPU or graphics processing unit. Later on we will have one lecture on the basic idea of GPU. For the time being, we will just mention that there is a unit called GPU in the graphics card, and the CPU assigns any graphics rendering task to this separate graphics unit, and we call this graphics unit as the display controller, which is a of course generic name, and in different systems it is called in different ways. So, essentially display controller deals with performing the multi-stage operations required to create or synthesize a 2D image. Now, the second component is video memory. So, output of display controller is some representation of the 2D image, and in video memory, which if we recollect from this generic architecture, which takes as input the output of the display controller, it stores the representation. Now, display controller generates the images in the digital format, strings of zeros and ones, which is expected because computer understands and processes information only in terms of zeros and ones. The place where we store it is simply the video memory, which is a dedicated part of the memory hierarchy. Now, as we all know, in the memory hierarchy of a computing system, we have RAM, ROM, secondary storage, cache, different levels. Video memory is also a part of those levels in the hierarchy, and typically it is situated in the separate graphics unit or graphics card, which is more popularly called VRAM or video RAM. Probably many of you or all of you have heard of this term. So, display controller generates image representation and stores, and that representation is stored in video memory. Then comes video controller. Again, let us go back to that generic architecture. Here video controller is situated here, which takes as input the information stored in video memory, and then it does something to display the image on the screen. So, what it does? It essentially converts digital image that is represented in the form of zeros and ones to analog voltages. Why? Because the voltages drive electromechanical arrangements which ultimately render image on the screen. So, screen essentially is a electromechanical mechanism, and to run this mechanism we require voltage, and this voltage is generated by the video controller based on the zeros and ones stored to represent the image. In each display screen we have a basic unit of display which is typically called pixels, and typically it is arranged in the form of a grid or matrix. Like if I draw a screen like this, so we will have pixel grid something like this, where each cell may represent a pixel, essentially a matrix form of pixels. Now, these pixels are essentially excited by electrical means, and when they are excited they emit lights with specific intensities. Now, these intensities give us the sensation of colored images or give us the sensation of colors. So, pixels are there on the screen, pixels are excited by electrical means. So, after excitation they emit some light with a specified intensity, which gives us a sensation of color. So, if some portion of an image is having the red color, the corresponding pixels will emit light with intensity of red color, so that we get the red color sensation. Now, the mechanism through which these pixels are excited is the job of the video controller. So, video controller essentially is tasked to excite pixels through electrical means by converting the digital input signal zeros and ones into some analog voltage signals, which in turn activates the suitable electromechanical mechanism which is part of the controller. So, that is in a very broad sense how a graphic system look like. So, it has three unique components: display controller, memory and video controller. Display controller is responsible for creating a digital representation of the image to be displayed, which is stored in the video memory, and then this image information is used to basically excite pixels on the screen to emit light of specific intensity to give us sensation of colored images. So, this job of exciting pixels on the screen is done by video controller. Now, in light of this broad description of a graphic system, let us now move to our next topic of types of graphic systems or graphic devices. So, there are broadly two types of graphic systems, which is based on the method used to excite the pixels. Now, what are these two types? One is the vector scan device, other one is the raster scan device. Let us start with the vector scan device. This type of devices or graphics devices are also known as random scan, stroke writing or calligraphic devices. In these type of devices, when we are talking of an image, that image is represented or assumed to be represented as a composition of continuous geometric primitives such as lines and curves. So, any image is assumed to be composed of lines and curves, and when we render or display these images on the screen, essentially we render these basic geometric shapes. So, we no longer talk about the whole image, instead we talk about the component lines and curves that define the image. In other words, a vector scan device excites only those pixels of the pixel grid that are part of these primitives. So, to a vector scan device there is no such concept as a full image, instead it only knows about constituent geometric primitives and it excites the pixels that are part of those primitives. An example is shown here. Consider this line in this left figure and the corresponding pixels, this is a truncated part of the grid, the corresponding pixels are highlighted in this right figure. So, to a vector scan device, the image is not the line, but only this set of pixels. It knows only about these pixels instead of knowing about this line, and these pixels are excited to generate the line image, and only these pixels are excited, other pixels are not excited. This is important, that in case of a vector scan device, we excite only the pixels that are part of the primitives, other pixels are not touched. As a result, what we need to do? We need to selectively excite pixels, which is a very tough job, which requires high precision, which is obvious, and complex hardware, which in turn makes these devices costly, because it takes money to develop such hardware with high precision. Also, due to this selective exciting, such type of devices, vector scan devices, are good for rendering wireframes, which are basically outlined images. For complex scenes, which involves lot of filled up areas, flicker is visible because of this mechanism of selective exciting, which is not a good thing. The other type of graphics devices is the raster scan device. Now, in raster scan device, an image is viewed as represented by the whole pixel grid. So, earlier we considered an image to be represented by only a subset of the whole pixel grid, but here we are considering the whole pixel grid and not only the selected pixels representing the primitives. So, when we render an image on a raster scan device, all the pixels are considered. In case of vector scan device, we considered only a subset and other pixels were not touched, but here all the pixels are considered. And how do we consider that? By considering the pixels in a sequence. What is the typical sequence? It is typically left to right, top to bottom. So, if we have a grid like this, then typically we start from left, move towards the right end, then go to the next row, move towards the right end and continue in this way. So, kind of this type of movement till we reach the lower right end point or end pixel. So, the same thing is mentioned here. So, the controller starts with the top left pixel and checks if the pixel needs to be excited. That information will be stored in the memory. So, if it needs to be excited, it excites the pixel or leaves it unchanged. But mind here that the pixel is considered for excitation and action is taken accordingly. It then moves to the next pixel on the right and repeat the steps till the last pixel in the row is reached. Then the controller considers the first pixel in the next row and repeats the steps, and in this manner it continues till the right bottom pixel of the grid. Now, this process of consideration of pixels in sequence or such sequential consideration of pixels is known as scanning. This is a more generic term used, that in raster scan devices pixel scanning takes place. Each row of the grid is known as a scan line. So, this sequential consideration is called scanning and each row in the pixel grid is known as scan line. Let us consider the same example here. Earlier we considered only the pixels that are part of this line, only these pixels. Now, we are considering all pixels starting from this top left corner, moving in this direction, then this row, so on till this point. So, each line is a scan line, and as you can see in this figure, right hand figure, the white pixels means they need not be excited. The system considered the pixel and found that they need not be excited, so it moved to the next pixel. And the filled up circles indicate excited pixels, which represents the line. So, that information was also there in the memory, and the video controller found out that these pixels needed to be excited. So, it excited those pixels. In the process, it considered all pixels in the grid and excited only those which needed to be excited. Now, the video memory of a raster scan system is more generally known as frame buffer, where each location corresponds to each pixel. So, the size of a frame buffer is equal to the screen resolution, the size of the pixel grid, which is very obvious, of course. Now, there is one interesting fact, we should be aware of it. Display processors are typically very fast. They work at the speed of CPU, that is nanosecond scale. So, any operation is done at a very less time, nanosecond level. On the other hand, video controllers are typically slower, much slower compared to display controllers, because they involve electromechanical arrangements which takes time to work. So, typical speed ranges in the millisecond level or millisecond scale. Clearly, there is a mismatch between the way display processor produces output, between the speed at which display processor can produce output and the speed at which the video controller can take that output as input. Now, assume that there is only one video memory or frame buffer. If the display controller outputs are fed directly as input to the video controller through that frame buffer, now the output is being produced very fast, but the input is being consumed at a much slower rate. So, the output may get overwritten before the entire output is taken by the video controller as input, which in turn may result in the image getting distorted, because before the current input is processed, the next input is ready and overwrote the current input. So, to address this concern, so we use the concept of frame buffers, where single buffer is not sufficient and we require at least two buffers. And if two buffers are used, it is called double buffering. Of course, there are cases with more than two buffers. Now, in case of double buffering, one buffer or one video memory is called primary and the other one is called secondary. So, now video controller takes input from one of the buffers, typically the primary buffers, whereas the display controller fills up the other or the secondary buffer. Now, when the video controller finishes reading input from the primary buffer, the primary now becomes secondary and the secondary becomes primary. So, a role reversal takes place and the process repeats. So, in this way the problem of overwriting the image information can be avoided. Another interesting fact to note here is called refreshing. Now, lights emitted from pixel elements, which gives us the sensation of color, starts decaying over time. So, it is not the case that the intensity of the emitted light remains the same throughout the display session. So, over time it starts decaying. So, intensity changes, which lead to fading of the scene after some times. However, pixels in a scene may get excited at different points of time. Thus, the pixels may not fade in sync. So, in an image, it is not necessary that every pixels fade in sync, so that it is not perceptible to the user. So, it may lead to image distortion. In order to avoid that situation, what is done is to keep on exciting the pixels periodically, which is known as refreshing. So, whatever is the excitation value, with that value there is a periodic excitement of the whole pixel grid. So, it is not an one time activity. One important consideration here is the refresh rate, at which rate we should keep on refreshing the screen, so that the changes are not perceptible to the human eye. So, the number of times a scene is refreshed per second is known as the refresh rate, which is represented in Hertz or Hertz, which is typically the frequency unit, and in case of displays it is typically considered to be 60 Hertz or 60 times per second screen should be refreshed. So, what are the pros and cons of a raster scan device? Clearly here, since we are not trying to excite selectively, so we do not require very high precision hardware. Scanning is a very straightforward job, so low precision hardware can do the job. Also, it is good for generating complex images, since we are considering all pixels anyway. So, it will not lead to flickers, unlike in vector scan. Due to these benefits, one is low cost, the other one is ability to generate complex images. Most of the displays that we see around us are based on raster graphic concept. So, we get to see only or mostly raster graphics devices around us, because it is low cost and good at generating complex images. Now, these two are from the point of view of hardware, vector scan device and raster scan device. There is a closely related term which probably you may have heard of, called vector graphics and raster graphics. Now, these two are not related to any hardware characteristics, unlike the previous terms vector scan and raster scan. In case of vector graphics, what we actually refer to is a way the image is represented. So, when we are talking of a vector graphics image, we are talking of the representation in terms of continuous geometric primitives such as lines and curves. So, if I say that a particular image is a vector graphics image, that means I am representing that image in terms of its constituent geometric primitives, lines and curves. In case of raster graphics, the representation is different. Like in raster scan device, in case of raster graphics, what we refer to is essentially representing the image as the whole pixel grid with the pixels which are supposed to be excited in an on state and others in a off state. So, if we are representing an image as a raster graphics image, essentially the image is stored in the form of whole pixel grid where some pixels are in the excited or on state, or at least it is indicated that these pixels should be in the on state. But again, it should be noted that vector graphics or raster graphics are terms to indicate the way images are represented. They have nothing to do with the underlying hardware. So, even if I represent an image in the form of a vector graphics, I can still use a raster scan device to display that image, and vice versa. If I represent an image as a raster graphics, I can still use a vector scan device to render it. So, we should be always clear about the distinction between these terms. One term is vector scan device and raster scan device. These are related to the way scanning takes place at the hardware level. Other terms are vector graphics and raster graphics. These represent the way images are represented internally rather than how they are rendered through actual display hardware. Now, let us come back to, or let us discuss another important topic, that is colored display. So far we are assuming that the pixels are monochromatic. Implicitly we are assuming that, but in reality we get to see images that are having colors. So, how they work? In a black and white display, each pixel may contain one type of element. For example, if you are aware of CRT or cathode ray tube displays and their internal mechanism, then you may be knowing that each pixel on a CRT display is having a single phosphor dot. Now, when we excite it to generate different light intensities, they result in different shades of gray, because that is a single phosphor dot. Like the illustration shown here, this is for CRT or cathode ray tube. Of course, nowadays it is very rare to see such displays, but it is good for pedagogical purpose to demonstrate in terms of a CRT. So, left side shows a typical CRT display, and on the right side we can see that how it works internally. So, it has a tube within which there are certain arrangements. These arrangements together constitute the video controller component of a generic system that we have discussed earlier. So, we have cathode, heater, anode arrangements, then a grid to control this electron flow, then deflection plates, vertical and horizontal, for deflecting the electron flow. So, essentially the arrangement generates a stream of electrons which hits a point on the screen, a pixel. After hitting, the pixel or the phosphor dot generates intensities which results in different shades of gray. That is in a very brief way how CRTs work, and in a similar way other displays also work. In a similar way, not in this exactly the same way. So, what happens in case of a color image? Now, in that case, each pixel contains more than one type of element. So, like for CRT, instead of having one phosphor dot, we can have 3 types of phosphor dots representing 3 primary colors, namely red, green and blue. So, when excited, each of these phosphor dots generates intensities related to these primary colors. So, the red dot generates red intensities, green dot generate green intensities, and blue dot generates blue intensities. When these intensities combine together, we get the sensation of desired color. So, as I said, each element is capable of generating different shades of the color, and when these shades combine, they give us the desired sensation of the color. Schematically, it looks somewhat like this figure, where we have 3 streams of electron beams hitting the 3 elements separately. Some special arrangements are there which are called masks to guide the electron beams to hit specific pixel group representing the 3 pixels, like the 3 shown here. And finally, we get the combination of different shades as the desired color. Now, there are 2 ways to generate these colored images. Essentially, what we want to do is, we want to have some values to guide the exciting of the individual type of elements in a colored display. So, there are 2 ways to do that. One is direct coding. In this case, what we do, individual color information for each of the red, green and blue elements of a pixel are stored directly in the corresponding frame buffer. So, in the frame buffer itself, we are storing the information of what should be the intensities of these individual colors. Clearly, that requires larger frame buffer compared to black and white frame buffers, because now in each location we are storing 3 values instead of 1. And this frame buffer should be capable of storing the entire combination of RGB values, which is also called the color gamut. So, later on we will learn more about these color gamuts, the idea. But the point to be noted here is that if we are going for direct coding, then we require a large frame buffer. Another way is color lookup tables, where we use a separate table, lookup table, which is of course a portion of the memory, where each entry of the table contains a specific RGB combination, and the frame buffer location contains pointer to the appropriate entry in the table. So, frame buffer does not store the values directly, instead it stores the location to the table which stores the actual values, like illustrated in this figure. As you can see, this is a frame buffer location which stores the pointer to this particular table entry, which stores the values of R, G and B. These are the values to excite the pixels accordingly. Now, if we want the CLT to work or the color lookup table scheme to work, then we have to know the subset of the colors that are going to be required in the generation of images. So, the table cannot store all possible combinations of R, G and B values. It stores only a subset of those combinations. So, essentially a subset of the entire set or the color gamut, and we must know that subset in advance to make this scheme work. If it is not valid, of course, this method is not going to work. But nowadays, we do not have any problem with this frame buffer or the size of the frame buffer, because memory is cheap. So, nowadays almost all graphic systems go for direct coding method, but in the earlier generation of graphical systems, when memory was a factor to determine the overall cost, CLT was much in use. In that period, of course, the screens were not equipped to display all sorts of complex images, and mostly wireframes were the images that were displayed. So, that time CLTs were much more useful, but nowadays we do not need to bother about CLT much unless there is some specific application, and we can directly go for direct coding method. So, let us summarize what we have learned today. We have got introduced to a basic graphic system which consists of 3 unique components, namely the display controller, the video memory and the video controller. Display controller is tasked to generate the image which is stored in video memory and which is used by the video controller to render it on a computer screen. We also learned about different types of graphic systems, namely the vector scan devices and the raster scan devices in brief, and the associated concepts, namely vector graphics, raster graphics, refreshing, frame buffers and so on. Also we got some idea of how color images are generated at the hardware level. So, these are basic concepts which will be useful in our subsequent discussions. In the next lecture, we will get an introduction to the basic processing that is required to generate a 2D image, that is the job of the display controller. Now, this processing is actually consisting of a set of stages which is collectively known as graphics pipeline. So, in the next lecture we will have an introduction to the overall pipeline. The topics that I have covered today can be found in this book, chapter 1, section 1.3, and you are also advised to go through the details on the CRT or the cathode ray tube display that is mentioned in this section, although I have not covered it here, for better understanding of the topics. So, we will meet again in the next lecture. Thank you and goodbye.